Good evening. Welcome to Story Hour in the Library. We'd like to take a moment and thank Yang for joining us today and doing her reading. If you're interested in finding out more about Story Hour in the Library, you can follow us at storyhour.berkeley.edu and see the full lineup, as well as find us on Facebook and on the UC Berkeley Library Twitter page. If you'd like to join our mailing list, we have a binder up at the front that you're more than welcome to sign on, and then we'll notify you as we have each readings every month. We'd like to invite you back to our sister program, Lunch Poems, next month on November 5th at noon in the same room. And then if you'd like to also join us on November 12th for Story Hour in the Library with Julia Shears at 5 o'clock in the Morrison. At this time, we'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones. And if you have to get up during the reading, please do quietly. And I'd like to invite Vikram up to do the introduction. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for coming. It's my pleasure today to introduce Yang Huang. I first met Yang at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, where we got to hang out in beautiful rural Vermont and talk a lot about writing and life and so forth. Since then, we've had the opportunity to hang out in Berkeley as well, since Yang is one of us. She works on this campus as a systems administrator at the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department. She grew up in Jiangsu, China, and first came to the US to study computer science. She attended Boston College and later worked as a computer engineer. But through all of this, she followed her childhood passion for writing and literature, which led her into earning an MFA at the University of Arizona. Her short stories and a feature-length screenplay have appeared in Asian Pacific American Journal, the Evansville Review, Future's Porcupine Literary Arts Magazine, and Stories for Film. Her first novel, Living Treasures, was published in 2014. Living Treasures opens in the Chinese countryside in the dead of winter. A young girl named Gu Bao watches a starving giant panda eat her grandparents' precious egg-laying hen. Gu Bao understands that the panda must do this to nurse her cub. This scene prefigures many of the themes of the novel. We follow Gu Bao's journey through young adulthood against the turbulent cultural upheavals of China during the 1990s. Her fellow students in Beijing are shot down in Tiananmen Square, even as Gu Bao experiences the unpredictable pangs of first love. She must make irrevocable choices about motherhood, negotiate the treacherous waters of politics, and struggle against official corruption and brutality. The novel is emotionally vivid and intensely personal, and yet it involves us in an epic moment of cultural and political change. It engages us in what Booklist called Gu Bao's journey from timid student to defiant adversary in the midst of personal and political upheaval. The reviewer for Library Journal wrote, "This skillfully written work embodies a young woman's journey toward independence and maturity at a time when her country's politics dictate conformity and oppression. The characters are thoughtfully well-rounded, the plot lines are true to life, and the narrative focuses refreshingly on the human spirit rather than political issues." Living Treasures won the bronze medal in the Living Now Book Awards, and it was a finalist for the Bellwether Prize, the Rubery Book Award, and the INDIEFAB Book of the Year Award. I think it signals the beginning of an exciting career, and I look forward to reading Yang's next book and the book after that, which I hope she's started working on. Please join me in welcoming Yang Huang.
Thank you. Thank you, Gigi and Vikram. I love the story hour. I was impressed how gracious and insightful Melanie and Vikram were when they introduced the authors, from Joyce Carol Oates to a debut author like myself. I'm so honored to be here and talking to you in this sacred room. I work at Cal, and my office is in the Corey Hall, Electrical Engineering Computer Science Department, thanks to my colleagues and friends who came to see me. The 3-minute walk from the Corey Hall to the Morrison Library feels like the journey of a lifetime. And I really appreciate the library parking permit. Thank you, Gigi. I was born and raised in China. I started writing in Chinese at an early age, doodling, if you will. My poems and essays won the student awards, But I had to stop daydreaming and choose physics as my major in college, because writing in China will inevitably bring trouble and even political prosecution. I came to the US at age 19 to study computer science. At 21, I became a computer engineer. 2 years later, I had a midlife crisis. So I went back to school and studied literature and writing. I felt like a blue-collar writer because I had to support my writing life by working as an engineer. I write in English, a second language, by choice. I cannot write about politically sensitive subject matters in Chinese because of my deeply ingrained self-censorship. I love working for the EECS department. Some of you may email me or visit my office for help with the computer issues. If I do a good job, then everything runs smoothly and nothing goes wrong. People don't know who I am. I'm invisible. My day job is very different from writing. It's technical work behind the scene. Writing requires me to take risks and put myself out there. As a writer, I have a rather optimistic worldview. I like to tackle big social problems in my fiction, put my characters under the test, let them endure in the darkest and most despairing hours. Let them use their ingenuity, much like an engineer, to find some sort of relief or solution. Not a cure-all, but a way out, so that I can move forward to rebuild their lives. Before I talk my book, I'd like to tell you the inspiration for my story. First, there was a panda. Like Vikram said, Living Treasures begins with a mother panda starving in the dead of the winter. We know pandas are herbivores, well, 99% of the time. There's a little-known secret. Panda is bear with digestive system a carnivore, thus derives little energy and protein from consuming bamboo. This vegetarian diet cannot fatten up a panda for it to hibernate in the winter. A panda has to consume 20 to 40 pounds of bamboo every day. Unfortunately, bamboo species flower periodically and die in mass. This causes a shortage of food, even famine. Pandas in the wild occasionally eat fish, mice, or birds if they can catch them. This panda mother comes to the village to look for food. She eats a chicken in order to survive and nurse a cub. A young girl bears witness to this. At 5 years old, she has survived earthquake, mudslide, and witnessed a rare phenomenon. This encounter, bordering on mystic, gives her new awareness that she will be tested, and she will persevere, that her life, humble as it is, has a higher purpose. My heroine, Miss Gu Bao, her name sounding like national treasure in Chinese, grows up in the 80s. It was a hopeful time, a liberal time. After dark ages of brutal prosecution and censorship in the Cultural Revolution, many Western thoughts were introduced and flourished in China. For the young people, it was sexy to be in a debate salon and wrangle over ideological issues. Before long, people began to demand human rights, democracy, and freedom. This is my husband during the heyday of 1989 student movement. I didn't have a picture because the people were still afraid of retaliation. Students began their protests at night, wearing facial masks to avoid being recognized or photographed. This might be mid-May, when the movement had gained so much support throughout China. It was safe to be seen as patriotic youth rather than condemned as a traitor conspiring to overthrow the government. Soon the situation escalated. The Tiananmen Square massacre came as a complete shock. To this day, we don't know how many were killed on the dawn of June 4th. The official story was that no one died in the square. The propaganda machine wiped out every evidence of demonstrations and subsequent crackdown. My poor parents were grateful that I wasn't in the square that night. They asked me to never speak of it. What good does it do for dead and living? My classmate, a hunger striker, dropped out of the university afterwards, and I never heard from him again. Dr. Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, is still in prison for speaking up about Tiananmen Square massacre. The student movement in 1989 was a defining moment of my generation. We experienced the hope, joy, and heartbreak of losing historical opportunity. I reflect on the tragedy for more than 20 years. I wanted to write a story about the students' fight, but with a more meaningful arc. There were many things leading up to the massacre and the following after that. But that night inevitably focused my story. It's just a starting point, a central metaphor for Bao's tragedy. I didn't want to end in Tiananmen Square. It needed to be in rural China, where a lot of injustice happened. My third inspiration is one-child policy. I like to see a show of hands. It doesn't matter where you were born. Will those of you not firstborns, please raise your hand. It's not a lot. About 1/5 of people in this room. You wouldn't have been born in China after 1976 if your parents hadn't fought hard to save your lives. Here's a little bit of history. In the 1950s, Chairman Mao, with a typical peasant mentality, banned the family planning and encouraged women to have as many children as possible. The population grew from 540 million in 1949 to 969 million in 1979, nearly 80% increase within 3 decades. In the 70s, the government tried to enforce strict controls to slow down the birth rate. Aside from some minority groups, every couple could only have 1 child. The problem is, local governments all had their own rules and regulations to enforce a policy. Some people lost their jobs after having a second child. Others were fined. As with many policies in China, there was abuse of power and corruption was rampant. In some villages, one-child policy worker team hired thugs to threaten and beat up people, force collect the fines, and even kidnap the women and the relatives. Some women had their full-term babies aborted. If drugs couldn't kill, a nurse injected medicine on the baby's temple where the mother was pushing. Some women died from brutal procedures, while others were forced into sterilization. My fourth inspiration is a blind lawyer, Mr. Chen Guangchen. While revising Living Treasures, I heard about Mr. Chen, a civil rights activist who worked on human rights issues in rural China. Blind from an early age and self-taught in the law, Chen is a barefoot lawyer who advocates for women's rights, land rights, and welfare of the poor. That was a career path I planned for Bao, that she will mature into a grassroots activist. To make a real change, even a small one, you cannot expect it to be passed down from the government, but rather, it needs to start with you and your actions. The victory isn't achieved by the talks in Tiananmen Square, but in every action you do, every person you help, and every sacrifice you make for the common good. The students in 1989 appealed to the ruling class to change the corrupt system. It ended in a massacre. That's no reason to give up. What if we don't fight, but live our lives to the fullest? Every person thinks he or she is free, despite what the government tells them. Live their lives like free people, take charge of their social responsibilities, and reach out to the less fortunate. I know Bao could do this because Mr. Chen did it with some success. In 2005, Chen organized a landmark class action lawsuit against the authorities in Shandong province for the excessive enforcement of one-child policy. What an amazing achievement for a courageous blind lawyer. In Living Treasures, village woman Mrs. Orchid already has a daughter. The one-child policy worker team gives her 2 forced abortions. When she gets pregnant again, she hides in the cave. There she meets Bao, who ended her pregnancy in order to continue a career as a law student. Bao is not impressed with Orchid at first, but she learns to admire Orchid's strength and her courage to have a child. She ends up risking her own life to protect Orchid. China has 1/5 of the world's population, so family planning is necessary to prevent catastrophic overpopulation. Even in this environment, Bao believes women should be able to make their own decisions. For example, in the cities, many educated people don't want to have children. Bao will argue, give their quotas to the people who need them. Bao is a woman with strong convictions. She's against the rigid one-child policy that victimizes women. In case you're wondering, this story is not autobiographical. The details are historically accurate, but my heroine is more vulnerable and courageous than people I know. Writing is a great adventure. I'm a blue-collar writer. I don't take writing for granted. It's a beautiful privilege. I guard my writing time jealously and negotiate it with my professional and parenting responsibilities. In order to write well, I try to separate writing from my personal life. My writer persona is different from my real-life persona. In daily life, I'm very organized, reliable, and conscientious. I multitask, set priorities, and deliver results on time. For example, I have to keep hundreds of computers running properly. It cannot be 1 minute late to pick up my children from school. My persona changes when I retreat into my writing life. I usually wait for my family to go to bed and then allow myself to unwind, freeing myself from the appointments, obligations, and such. Sometimes I overlook the dirty dishes in the sink. I take off my jeans, change into baggy pants, comfy socks, and slippers. I manage to eat healthy and exercise, but I won't set the alarm clock or tight deadline for my writing. Instead, I cultivate patience and a habit of pushing beyond my limit. I love to do lap swim, my exercise to stay healthy and strong. If my goal is 30 laps, I usually go to 31 or 32 laps. This is a reminder that whatever my goal is, I always do a little extra. Not something to show off, but a habit, a promise that I keep between me and my work, that can push beyond my physical limit every time I use my body or mind. I published 10 short stories. I wrote 3 unpublished novels. Living Treasures, the 4th novel I wrote, and first one published. Writing is simple, basic, and austere. Don't wait for inspirations or validation. The writing will create the mood, and style will take care of itself. The common wisdom is that every writer needs to write autobiography. That is usually the first book to get it out of your system. The first book is like a gift. You don't know how to go about it. You dabble, you try this and that, and finally it works to extent. You write a second book with more confidence and skill. By third or fourth book, you may have found your form. You know how to tell a story. But are you getting better with each book? Anton Chekhov wrote about his own growth as a writer. One wants to be mature. That is one thing. And for another, the feeling of personal freedom is essential. And that feeling has only recently begun to develop in me. I used not to have it before. The place was successfully filled by my frivolity, carelessness, a lack of respect for my work. Listen carefully. This is honest confession by one of the greatest short story writers in history. Write a story how a young man who has served in a shop, sung in a choir, been at high school and university, who has been brought up to respect everyone of higher rank and position, to kiss priests' hands, to reverence other people's ideas, who has liked dining with his rich relations and been hypocritical before God and men for the mere consciousness of his mere own insignificance. Write how this young man squeezes a slave out of himself, drop by drop, and how waking one beautiful morning he feels that he has no longer a slave's blood in his veins, but a real man's. This realization gives me chills, that writing is to squeeze a slave out of my blood, drop by drop. Writing is simple, basic, and austere. Being a working mother and a woman writer, I think of writing as a fight in an otherwise calm life. It begins with the urge to express my authentic self. Through hard work and relentless introspection, I shed my polite mask, tear off the layers of complacency, prejudice, and hypocrisy, to reach deep inside and feel the beating of my own heart, discover who I am and what I believe in, and then pour my soul into the characters and their stories. Literature is different from life. Life is one thing happening after another, endless and messy. Literature is not religion either. Religion has structure and gives life meanings. Literature falls somewhere between life and religion. There's no right or wrong anywhere on the spectrum. I began writing because other books didn't express my worldviews. Not because they're not good. A lot of them are amazing. But they fall in different spots on the spectrum, which gives me the opportunity to express my unique perspective. And I'm not the only one. Other writers have shared my views. They may or may not be my contemporaries. Writing is a craft. If used well, it helps me express my authenticity by spinning a web of lies that I cannot do in life or in religion, because I cannot risk turning the world upside down. In fact, I cannot be 1 minute late to pick up my children from school. But in writing, I'm free to tear down the world and use my imagination and craft to build a new world, a life enriched with meanings, insights, and hope for a future. I learned much from watching my heroine develop and mature in the course of a novel. A young woman who wants to become a lawyer, Bao has so much to lose at the beginning: her virginity, her baby, and her career. When she's confronted with evil, her conscience wakens. She takes a stand for what she believes in and risks everything in her life. Do we have what it takes to fight for our true beliefs? If we look deep inside, we'll find a hero or heroine buried underneath the layers of politeness, the mundane, and compromises. If we're true to ourselves, that hero or heroine will awaken, summon their courage, elicit help, and open doors to new careers, new relationships, and creativities. Life is not merely thing to be tolerated, but celebrated. We become free even as we're trapped inside this transit shell, this small building, in this unjust world. Thank you. I'll read two scenes from my book. The first scene is when Bao receives a letter from her best friend Lily. Lily's first love was killed on June 4th, 1989. Lily's letter was as thin as an empty envelope. Bao sat on bed to open it. You wouldn't believe what I found out when I got home. Hongzhi was killed. Not comprehending the news, she reread the first line and continued reading with a hand covering her mouth. He went to Tiananmen Square on June 3rd with sister to see what was happening there. He brought a camera. They were separated by the crowd. Hongzhi didn't return by 4 a.m. on June 4th. His sister woke up the parents, who set out to look for him. They headed toward the square, but it was overrun with soldiers. They went to nearby hospitals and worked their way through the sick rooms to the morgue. The bodies were in the drawers. His father pulled out one after another looking for him. They finally found Hongzhi at the No. 3 hospital. Doctor recalled a young man wearing a white t-shirt printed with Great Wall, like his parents described. 2 students had carried him in. His camera disappeared. He had 2 rolls of unused films in his pocket. He was shot in the head. Why didn't I go home with Hongzhi? If I were with him, I would never have let him take any pictures with a flash. He was so naive. I couldn't bring myself to go to his funeral. He's alive in my heart. I remember our last dinner, and it was also our first. We never kissed. I could give him 3 children, or 10, whatever suits him. Someday the murderers will be on trial. I want to become a lawyer. Lily. Bao folded the letter in half, then a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, until her fingers could no longer bend the paper. Strength left her suddenly. She fell upon the pillow, drew up her legs, and closed her eyes. These things could cause my book to be censored in China, but my book didn't criticize the Chinese government for the Tiananmen Square massacre. Instead, I took a more radical political stand by disregarding the impact of the brutal suppression. We can and should move on from tragedy, by not giving in, by not giving up, by becoming free despite the government's suppression and censorship. In the second scene, Bao encounters a mother panda in the wild the second time. By helping the panda, she finds the strength to confront her own personal crisis. Angry roars startled Bao. There was a fur 10 meters away, its bark heavily clawed. Animal droppings littered the area. She glimpsed the furry Bao amidst the green bushes. The glaring sunlight might be playing a trick on her. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut. When she reopened them, the black and white Bao whipped through the air. A round head perked up from behind a clump of bush. She covered her mouth to stifle a shout. A giant panda raised its arms above its head, stretched and yawned cavernously. As it rolled up from the ground, she stood in awe of its full figure. Its back was broad and muscular, the white of its coat striking in somber forest. Its round head had almost hypnotic effect as it lumbered closer and closer toward her. Suddenly bellowed and raked the air with a paw. Before she could hide, the panda turned its head and fixed its small eyes upon her. The black goggles made its eyes look wistful and sad. The panda gave agitated bleating hunks, a strangely vulnerable and timid sound from so large an animal. She noticed a foot caught in a coiled white snare. Since the white was taut, the panda couldn't touch her. Bao drew closer. At first, the panda emitted mild threats. As she took a few more steps, it gave a peculiar chomping sound, teeth clicking and lips smacking in a show of anxiety. When this failed to deter her, the panda emitted a roar so explosive that Bao involuntarily turned to flee. In her haste, she bumped her shoulders against a tree trunk. Then she heard a gunshot, dull and loud like a firecracker, echoing in the valley. The pelt of a panda was worth a good deal of money to the poachers. As if sensing the danger, the panda charged Bao. Its attack abruptly thwarted by the end of the snare cable. It bit large slivers of wood from the tree, roared, and sweated the air in frustration. Take it easy now, big guy. In her pant pocket, Bao found a pair of foldable travel scissors. She began to cut the wide snare with the scissors. Her heart pounded and she was short of breath, but her hand didn't tremble. This could be the panda cub from childhood. She wouldn't watch her suffer and be killed by poachers. Slumping against the fur, the panda scratched and pawed flies off its face. She cut the old rusted wire that wound around the tree. The scissors pinched her fingers until they were sore and numb. She bent the half-cut wire back and forth. The panda snorted to itself, its head bobbing up and down. Finally, the wire broke open, and the panda was free. Thank you. I can answer questions. Yes, Carrie.
What sort of adjustments do you find yourself making to write in English?
I can tell the true story just the way as it is. If I write in Chinese, I tend to write in euphemisms, fables. I throw in a lot of literary device there, but writing English is actually a little simpler. I just focus on tell a good story. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you so much, first of all. This is great. And then my question is, what is the most, well, for you, what is the most difficult part of the writing process? And my follow-up question is, how have you overcome that difficulty?
The most difficult part of writing process, actually every part is difficult. I think the second draft is actually really difficult. You know, the first draft, I usually hurry through it and just get the story out, figure out what I want to tell. But second draft, I have to throw away a lot of it. You know, sometimes the entire story, start all over again. And you have to really see why you want to write this story. And sometimes a book takes years, and you change. You know, you grow to be a different person. You know, what started out to be important is not important anymore. And you need to still follow it. You know, don't lose sight of the story, but also acknowledge that you have grown as a person and as a writer. It's a tremendously difficult fight, you know, against your own limitations. So yeah, I think, you know, writing gives me just to challenge myself in the deepest sense, you know, in every way as a person. That's why I can never get bored from writing.
What's your mechanical process? How do you keep track of research and do you take notes?
Yeah, I do take notes. I usually throw a lot of material in a scratch file, and the scratch file could be like mini makes, you know, and pictures. I keep everything there just in case something's useful. And as the story evolves, you will find a lot of it it's not useful, and then you go on to something else. But I like to dig through my pile of, you know, the wealth of information. Because, you know, I used to write a short story about dogs. I read like 20 books on dogs. I just want to know, you know, more information. And through those things, I find my story. In terms of keep track of it, it's actually really difficult. I guess I don't keep track of all the little details, but I do make sure my main characters and several main characters stay on track, so they don't, they don't contradict themselves too badly. But sometimes the unpredictable moments are just gold. You know, you discover something that you have to discover in your writing. You never know what it can teach you, and these are just best moments and worst because it's so hard and it frustrates you. Yeah, I think I just collect all these files in materials in files and folders, and every subject matter has a big file. Yes. It is totally different, I have to say. But it does help because I'm very methodical about writing. I don't believe in inspiration. I believe in sitting down and get something done. And, you know, have this kind of discipline. Yeah, I think I don't wait. And I don't have this romantic notion about being a writer. because for me, it's all work. And I think this really helps just work. Do you have a question? Okay. Yes.
After you were done compiling the first draft of your story and you actually reread it over and you thought about, have you ever had moments where you were afraid of either reactions that you would get from other people, or you were afraid there was a lot of political conflict with if it were to become really publicized in like China or something like that? Were there times where you felt like you had to question whether or not you were going to cut something out, or, and if you did, why? And if you decided to keep something, why?
Thanks for your question. And my worry when I write in English, I don't worry about the political things at all. I don't worry about censorship. That's the reason I write in English. It's so difficult. It took me many years to be able to write in English so that I can have this freedom. So I don't worry about the political censorship. But I do worry about telling a bad story. Sometimes, taking shortcuts. And, when I go through it, I try to find out those cheap stuff, cut off the cheap stuff, cut off the fat, and keep the story lean and tight. And, my biggest fear is to tell a story that's just not efficient and doesn't have not honest or just I haven't gotten to that point yet. So a book really takes many drafts. Like at a certain point, at the 10th draft, I thought, thank God I'm not one of these characters. I don't have to go through this kind of traumatic experience. Once I get to that, I know I have gotten into something that really scares me and that's really honest. And it's not, you can never get it from first draft. I can't. Yeah.
So, because you wrote it in English, did you have an audience in mind before you decided that you were going to write in English and Chinese or something?
It's only, you speculate. I thought that might be I write about historical moments. It's a historical novel and something I feel passionate about. But you don't let it dictate. You still find how you want to tell a story. That's really that makes a story unique and authentic. So I don't think you should write for your audience, but it may affect your decision to choose what type of story you want to write. Ultimately, you tell the story you want to tell. Otherwise, people can tell that you're writing for them, and they think you're playing trick on them. Yeah, it cannot be faked. So. Hi.
You mentioned that you went through a midlife crisis.
Yeah.
And changed gears, but writing is a lot of work.
Yes.
At what point do you feel that you've achieved something that you can feel good about it?
I actually never felt that. I don't think I've gotten to that point yet. Otherwise, I'd be too satisfied with myself. I think it's just a continual journey.
I guess maybe not completely satisfied, but do you find that there's a eureka moment that suddenly there's something that is working positively, that you can take a deep breath and go, oh yeah, this is what I'm to tell?
I guess I'm always very aware of my physical reaction toward writing. Writing is not really a cerebral, experience. If it feels right, like if you work so hard, you get stuck for so long, then suddenly you find a way out, and it is, and you find that thing scares you, and you have gotten to a point that you were not before. So I guess I really treasure those moments, but it takes many years, and I never can stay in that moment because then something else comes along and say it's still not good enough. And even completing a book, actually, it's not that great experience. After I finish a book, I feel really depressed because I give so much of it, and now I have to start something new, and that new thing is so crappy, you know. So it is just a journey, you know. I try to enjoy those moments that, you know, it's really, really rewarding, and it's, yeah, it takes everything. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you.
Oh. Yes.
You said you wrote 3 novels, but this is the first one you published. I was
Right.
curious whether it was your decision to not publish the first 3.
I couldn't get them published. I got the agents shopped around for a little bit. Ultimately, you know, it didn't publish. But you know, publishing, I don't know, I just love writing. Publishing is so much work, really. And sometimes I wonder what the fuss is about, you know. I just want to write. And I really have, you know, if I have to set my priorities, it would be writing. And I wouldn't encourage people to try to publish too early. It really takes away the energy, and you kind of worry about the audience and all these things that makes writing less, you know, authentic, you know. But one day these books may be published, you know. Yes.
General, out of curiosity question. You said you have kids, right? Do you know how old they are? I don't know how old they are.
Yeah, my kids are 10 and 12. Yeah.
Ever get the opportunity or ever ask you to, you know, read your book if
they both have read it, even though it wasn't appropriate for them. And I was shocked when my 9-year-old was reading it. I was like, you have to give it back to me. He said he doesn't have other books to read. And he read it in 2 afternoons. It was so easy to read. And, you know, it was surreal to see him in the after school eating apple and reading my book. And, you know, and he recommended to his brother, the 11-year-old at the time. His brother liked the fantasy books, so he wasn't very impressed. But my younger one's really impressed, and he was proud of me. So, and sometimes he gives me editing advice. So every child is different. And, you know, I'm very happy. You know, they actually, because they did grumble a lot when I locked my room, and they just say, you know, I left them out. Then they see this book, it is real to them. It was quite a moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We are selling her book. It's for $20, and she will be signing them at the table at the front. Thank you, and we hope to see you next month at Story Hour.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.